Assalamu alaikum. This podcast was brought to you by Seekers Guidance. Support us in spreading free, reliable Islamic knowledge to millions around the world by becoming a monthly supporter. Make a small donation at seekersguidance.org/donate. As little as $10 a month can go a long way. How do I identify the beginning and the end of my monthly menstrual cycle? The question reads, how do I identify the beginning and the end of my monthly menstrual cycle? طيب. So, in the Shafi'i School of thought, the minimal age for menstruation is 9 full lunar years. So, because that's the minimal age, anything that takes place before that, in terms of bleeding and so forth, that wouldn't necessarily be considered hayd from a Shari'i perspective. There is no maximal age for the end of it. So it doesn't matter how old one becomes, there's no maximal age, so it's possible until death, at least from a Shari'i perspective, inshallah. And then the minimal menstrual period is a day and a night. It generally lasts between 6 and 7 days, but the maximal period is 15 days. So if there's bleeding and it doesn't accumulate to bleeding for a day and a night, then that would be considered not hayd. But of course, you only know until after that time period has elapsed. And if the bleeding continues still beyond 15 days, then that's a special case called istihada. And there are specific rules in relation to that. The minimal interval of clean period, in other words, a period of non-bleeding between menstruations, is 15 days. So if there isn't 15 days of clean period between hayd periods, then that would technically have to be considered as one hayd period, and there are special rules in relation to that as well. So this is just the basic framework. There is no maximal limit to the number of days between menstruation. So a woman could have menstruation and then have a long period of time where there's no menstruation and then menstruate again. Whenever a woman, so this is now directly related to the question. The question was, how do I identify the beginning and the end of my period? So the direct answer to that is, whenever a woman who is old enough to experience a hayd, so we've given the framework for that, if she notices bleeding, even if she's pregnant, then she must avoid what a woman in her period avoids. So she should consider herself in the state of hayd as soon as she sees bleeding. And then, of course, the time framework would guide her as to whether to continue to judge that as hayd or not. If it ceases, if that bleeding stops in less than 24 hours, then it is not considered menstruation. And whatever prayers and fasting was omitted as a result of the genuine assumption that it was hayd, that would have to be made up. So qada would have to be made of that because it wasn't hayd. And then it is not considered menstruation at all, so she has to repay whatever she has omitted. If it ceases at 24 hours, so if it ceases after 24 hours or at 24 hours, or within 15 days of first noticing bleeding, or between the two, then it is considered menstruation, it is considered hayd, and Allah knows best. If it goes beyond 15 days, then she has what is considered istihada. That's roughly translated as chronic vaginal bleeding. And there are, again, as I said, special rules in relation to how she should be viewing that. And this would differ from woman to woman. So those rules can become a bit complex. And I would advise for any woman who experiences this to speak to a qualified scholar, ideally a woman scholar, so that she can guide you in this regard. And then the last point that I wish to note on this is that yellow or dusky colored discharge is considered part of the menstrual flow. So generally, some women experience a discharge that's not her normal discharge. It's definitely a different color. So it's yellow or dusky colored or brownish. Before and after the period, this would have to be considered as part of the menstrual flow. And then So I said that was the last point. Perhaps I should just add this point. If a woman has times of intermittent bleeding and cessation, so she bleeds a little bit and then she stops, and then she bleeds a little bit and then she stops, for an interval of 15 days or less, if this happens, and the times of bleeding, so the periods that she actually bled for, if she counts those times and collectively they amount to at least 24 hours, then the entire duration of that interval, bleeding and stopping, that entire duration is considered hayd. So initially she would have to check and see, okay, there's bleeding, it's not bleeding, and so forth. So she'd have to measure that, and then she would discover that no, this is actually a hayd, and this is how her normal cycle proceeds. So I hope that assists in terms of answering the question, how do I identify the beginning and the end of my period? Barakallahu feekum. We proceed to the next question. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Does vaginal discharge break one's wudu? Does vaginal discharge break one's wudu? So, of course, the discharge that we spoke about above, that would be counted as hayd, but we are not speaking about that now. We are speaking about usual vaginal discharge, right? The usual moisture. So, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The type of moisture or mucus, as it is, sort of biologically referred to, is from a woman's private part, or rather, the type of moisture that comes from a woman's private part is considered pure. It's considered tahir in the Shafi'i school. That's the first point. The second point is your wudu would be invalidated when anything exits the private parts, but not because of the discharge that you were in contact with, because it comes from the private parts. So in essence, if a woman experiences vaginal discharge from inside of the vagina, and it comes out of the vagina, that discharge is something that comes out of the private parts. And the rule in the Shafi'i school of thought, there are 4 things that break one's wudu. One of that is kharijun min as-sabilain, anything that exits the front or rear private part, male or female, right? Whether it comes from the male or female. And in this sense, it will break the wudu. However, there are certain other points that one should understand about vaginal discharge, and it's a very important issue. So I'll take this opportunity to elaborate a little bit on the issue. So in the Shafi'i school of thought, Ibn Hajar al-Haytami, rahimahullah ta'ala, he classified vaginal moisture or discharge as follows, right? You get that which is pure, so the moisture or mucus that sometimes exits a woman's private part is usually whitish in color between madhi and perspiration. So madhi is a more sticky, more cloudy substance, and perspiration basically takes on the fluidity of water. If it exits from an area of the vagina that must be washed in the purificatory bath, in istinja, etc., that area is generally referred to in fiqh as that which is exposed when the woman would squat, right? So that area, if it comes from that area, it is considered pure. So this is essentially the outer parts of the woman's private part. Then there's another type of discharge which is considered impure, and that is if it exits from an area of the vagina that does not require washing in a purificatory bath. In other words, when a woman takes a ghusl, she's not expected to wash herself internally. Right? The only parts of a private part that need to be washed is that which is exposed at the time of squatting. So, if there's discharge that comes from deeper than that area, then that is considered impure. But then there is moisture that is categorized differently by different scholars. So there's differing views on this. That is, if the moisture exits from an area between what was just mentioned, so between the outer parts of the private part and the inner parts of the private part. There are differing views in this regard, but the official view of the Shafi'i school is that it is pure, it is not najasa. So this is from Hashiyatul Jamal ala Sharh al-Manhaj. even though the moisture from deep within the female private part is considered najasa upon exiting the vagina, right, what we just explained above, any quote-unquote contamination, anything that is afflicted or touched by that particular type of discharge, that would be overlooked. That is ma'fuun anhu. And there's an important reason why we mention this. So, for example, when engaged in physical intimacy with one's spouse, the male private part is not considered to have been, again, quote-unquote, contaminated. It is not considered to become mutanajjis or affected with najasa after intercourse. Similarly, if there's a legitimate reason for a lady to insert something into her private part, for example, a doctor's examination, or she needs to examine herself for some reason, then whatever comes from that inner private part is not considered to be affected by najasa. Even though it's considered impure inside, it is considered ma'fuun anhu, in other words, overlooked. It is pardoned by the Sharia. And again, this is from the works of Ibn Hajar al-Haytami. So a related question to this is, if a woman uses, if she has some discharge on her clothing or on the towels, etc., would that have to be considered najasa? And again, the answer is no, based on what we've just explained above. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Is it necessary for women to wear niqab in the Shafi'i school? Is it necessary for women to wear niqab in the Shafi'i school of law? Now, first and foremost, Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ba'd. This is one of those matters upon which there has been differences of opinion among the scholars, not only from the Shafi'i school, but since the time of the Sahaba, ridwanullahi ta'ala alayhim ajma'in. There is no clear evidence, that espouses the obligation of wearing niqab or the non-obligation of wearing niqab from the Quran. It's all interpretable. The same thing applies to the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There is evidence to espouse both views. Number one, that it is obligatory, and the other one, that it is Sunnah. But before we speak about whether it is obligatory or Sunnah, the key element in learning Islamic law, I believe, is to understand the matters upon which there is no difference, and then proceed to understand the differences thereafter. Which is why when one studies any particular school of thought, the traditional methodology in terms of studying fiqh is to study and master one school of thought while having the other schools in one's periphery. So you do have an appreciation of the other schools, but you need to be grounded in one school. Otherwise, especially for a non-scholar, and even when it comes to scholars, it requires mastery in scholarship. One should stick to one school of thought for as long as possible and be grounded in that, and then have an understanding of the other schools. So when it comes to the matter of niqab, the reason why I'm mentioning this is there's some confusion in the ummah that niqab is completely foreign to Islam and it's a cultural practice. Now, when it comes to traditional Islam, the schools of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, there is no madhab that regards it as foreign to Islam or cultural practice. The ruling basically goes between fard and sunnah. So, is the face of a woman awra, or is it not? There are differing views, but everyone agrees that it is either fard or sunnah. Nobody says, no, it's not fard, it's not sunnah, it's nothing, it's makruh, it's haram. So that's something that we need to understand. The only time in which it is prohibited for a woman to cover her face would be when she is in the state of ihram, and even there, scholars differ as to how to treat that particular situation. Now we zoom into the Shafi'i school. Upon reading the Shafi'i school on this particular matter, it's easy to become confused because different books would carry different opinions on this matter. So there are differing views on this matter in the Shafi'i school, right? And scholars have reconciled these views in various ways. So you may find that some have actually expressed, no, it is obligatory in the Shafi'i school, and they would have evidence to espouse their view. I'm going to present here the fatwa of my late teacher, Mufti Taha Kiran, rahimahullah ta'ala, in which he covers this topic, and he says that covering the face and the hands is not obligatory, but sunnah in the Shafi'i school of thought, but it requires some elaboration. Bismillah. So he notes, Muhammad Taha Kiran, rahimahullah ta'ala, was asked regarding a woman covering her face and hands in the Shafi'i school, and thus responded that it is not obligatory for her. Moreover, Ibn Hajar, rahimahullah, mentioned this in his Tuhfa, that's Tuhfatul Muhtaj, the sharh of the Minhaj of Imam An-Nawawi, rahimahullah ta'ala. So, differing from both Imam Al-Ramli and Khatib Shirbini in their book. So, that's from Nihayatul Muhtaj and Mughni al-Muhtaj, respectively. So, these works are all commentaries on the Minhaj al-Talibin of Imam An-Nawawi. Now, the Minhaj al-Talibin of Imam An-Nawawi is essentially the Mufta Bihi book in the madhab, meaning that if fatwa is going to be passed, it is going to be passed first and foremost from the work of Imam Nawawi, rahimahullah ta'ala, which is essentially a synopsis of all of the previous scholars' works, and then a synthesis thereof between himself, Imam Nawawi, and Imam Al-Rafi'i, rahimahullah ta'ala, who are, for all intents and purposes, the spokesman of the Shafi'i school of thought in the traditional sense. Then other scholars would take the work of Imam Nawawi, rahimahullah ta'ala, and further elaborate on that, so that we can have an appreciation for how to really study the work of Imam Nawawi and how to pass fatwa accordingly. So these scholars that we mentioned now, they all write commentaries on the book of Imam Nawawi, Minhaj al-Talibin.